And I just do the arrow. Thank you for inviting me to come again to speak to your Rotary Club. You guys are always a very receptive audience, and I very much appreciate it because I love to brag on N.O. Nelson. I always say he's my favorite man outside of my husband. So Mr. Nelson was born in 1844 and he died in 1922. And it was just a century ago last week. Which is why some of you may have seen an article in the newspaper where the city did a proclamation about N.O. Nelson. And that's because of the legacy that you can see all over this community that was left by Mr. Nelson. So just to name a few things quickly, we have an N.O. Nelson School. We have a LeClaire School, which was named after the village that he founded. We have the historic N.O. Nelson campus of Lewis and Clark Community College. We have the historic LeClaire Field. We have LeClaire Park. We have the Nelson Memorial Fountain. And of course, there are all of the homes and families in LeClaire that leave a legacy also. So I think a lot of you have probably heard about LeClaire, so I'm just going to summarize briefly. LeClaire was founded by N.O. Nelson, who wanted to provide a better life for his employees. So he went looking, he had factories in St. Louis, and he went looking for property that would be in the country. So there would be a cleaner, healthier place to live. St. Louis at that time, I don't know if you're aware, but there were days where because of the coal smoke and the pollution in St. Louis, it seemed like dusk all day long. So it was not a healthy place to live. So he was looking for a healthy place to live. He was already providing profit sharing and other progressive benefits for that time. I mean, he had things like sick time and death benefits and all that kind of stuff that they didn't even talk about in the 1880s and 90s. He also wanted to be able to give them recreational and educational opportunities, but by the time they went home from work, it was too far to come back. So by creating this village over here in Edwardsville, and by the way, the people of Edwardsville underwrote the cost of the land. They came together in just a few weeks' time and raised $20,000 to buy the land. And there were strings attached to it. He had to hire so many people before the first chunk was given to him, and he had to build so much before the next. But he fulfilled all the obligations except for one that wasn't written down, but that they thought was just naturally going to happen. And that is, they didn't become part of Edwardsville. So it was 1890 to 1934 that LeClaire was an independent village. It was considered a model village, and it was written about internationally. You could, I've seen European publications that talked about it. You can find newspapers from New York, San Francisco, and everywhere in between talking about this wonderful cooperative village in LeClaire. The recreational and educational opportunities were many. And I'll talk about those a little bit, but the thing is, they offered a freedom of choice. We had a lot of company towns at that time, but you had to toe the line. You rented from the company, you bought from the company store, and if the company offered things, you were kind of pressured to do them. You had a freedom of choice in LeClaire. You could live in LeClaire and work in the factories. You could work in the factories and live in Edwardsville. You could live in LeClaire and work in Edwardsville. It didn't matter, and you could take part in whatever you wanted. So he truly did create a center where his workers could live a better life and have more opportunities. By the way, that was his home, if you want to. That's at the corner. It's on Jefferson between Hale and Holyoke. The thing is, he had a grandson in the 1950s who was a decorator and decided that two-story Georgian columns would look good on that house. So it doesn't look like that anymore. So with education, they started a kindergarten right away, like in 1892. They had a manual training school for a time where students would go to school half days and work half days. They had a college for about 2 years. And there are people that became attorneys and doctors that said they got their start taking classes at LeClaire. They had an educational lecture series every week, and they brought in people like Jane Addams and Edward Everett Hale and Samuel Golden Rule Jones. These were all people that were part of that social betterment movement of the at the turn of the last century. And they were people that Nelson corresponded with, and you can find some of that correspondence even today. Another thing that people don't think about is that they kind of started the Edwardsville High School sports program. Edwardsville High School played at LeClaire Field until 1924, when they built the new high school, which is now the old high school, over on West Street. So they offered facilities, not just to the residents of LeClaire, but also to the residents of Edwardsville or wherever they were located. In recognition of Nelson's dedication to education, and he was known for that, they've named 3 different campuses in town for Nelson. He was also on the library board back at the time and provided additional funds for the library. He created a library in LeClaire using his own collection at first. And as I said, he provided space for the football and hosted the lecture series. And people came from all over for that lecture series. I've read numerous articles where they would hold things in the schoolhouse, which is now the Children's Museum. And at that time, the building was constructed in such a way that you could move all the walls out of the way and have one gigantic hall. And they often had standing room only with the windows open. The other thing that he brought were families. For example, William Shaw came over from the factories in St. Louis to be a manager over here at the factories. His grandson became a chancellor for SIUE, Buzz Shaw. The Rizzoli and Erspalmer families, who became, they were Italian craftsmen, and they heard about LeClaire and came here. Numerous members of the family came here, and they became architects and carpenters and just very skilled craftsmen. They also founded the planing mill. There was a William Thomas, who was a Edwardsville band leader. The Mormons, George Mormon, came and settled in LeClaire. His son, George, became the mayor of Edwardsville. And then there was the Merkel family that, and this wasn't that unusual. They were in New York and heard about LeClaire and came to work in the factories. All of these families have descendants that still live here today. So that too is a legacy of N.O. Nelson. So, and you also have the landscape. He hired landscape architects to design those curvilinear streets that you see going through LeClaire, with Hale Avenue and Holyoke. The homes, many of the early homes were built by the factory because they had to ramp it up to encourage home ownership. The factory buildings themselves, which are now the Lewis and Clark campus here in Edwardsville, named for Nelson. The schoolhouse, which is the Children's Museum. The Ball Diamond, that has been an athletic field since 1890. So when they say historic LeClaire Field, it indeed is historic. And they said that during the 1920s, when they had the trolley leagues, which would bring people in, you would play towns that were all on the trolley routes, and it would bring visitors in, and they would sometimes have 800 people at a ball game. So that was a very popular pastime, especially before air conditioning. And then, of course, there's the jewel of LeClaire, LeClaire Park. Park Fest is this weekend. So that's the legacy of N.O. Nelson. I just wanted to emphasize the fact that he was someone who had the best interest of his workers at heart and really of his fellow man. He created schools and homes for consumptives and all kinds of different endeavors in an attempt to give a hand up. So I always say I live in the only neighborhood in town that was founded on kindness. N.O. Nelson was a multimillionaire at the turn of the last century, and he gave it all away before his death in 1922. So then I'd like to talk about a couple of events coming up. And of course, LeClaire Park Fest is right up there at the top of the list. That is Sunday. It's held every year on the third Sunday in October. Knock on wood, we have never had rain. It's always a fun time. And we have, there's 3 live bands. There's delicious festival food. Got a lot of people online looking forward to that chicken and dumplings. We have over 60 booths with either food or artisans and crafters. There's a book sale, there's a vintage car show. And we just learned the other day that the Wienermobile is coming to LeClaire Park Fest. Does it get any better than that? Now, I'm also with the Historical Society, and we have an event on Saturday that's an old-fashioned ball game. And this is a game that is played by 2 teams that are trying to preserve the rules of 1860. So there's no spitting, no sliding, and no, oh, there's a third one, but no spitting, no sliding, oh, and no swearing. I haven't heard whether that applies to the audience as well or not. But the game is free. There'll be concession stands by the Historical Society. You can come out at 12:30 to 1:30. There's batting practice, and you're welcome to give it a try using the old ways. And at 1:30, the game itself will start. The Historical Society, we have been incredibly busy this year. And right now in the fall of the year, this is when we ramp up our membership drive. So I wanted to encourage all of you to become members. We've got a speaker series. We do living history events, trivia nights, just all kinds of activities. But the most important thing that we do is to preserve the documents, artifacts, and stories of Madison County. And all of that, of course, takes money. And if we raise our membership, then it improves our odds of getting grants. So we really want to move those membership numbers up, and we would appreciate anyone who would be willing to join the society. We always say, if you join, you're supporting us, but you don't have to volunteer unless you want to. But most of our members just support us financially, and we greatly appreciate that. Now, I've got a project coming that I'd also like your help with, and it doesn't cost you anything except a little time. The November newsletter is going to be called Our Stories. And I'm asking people to send me a short story of an event, a place, a person. It can be about anything that you want. I have, well, my husband is writing about the early days of Lovejoy Library. He worked for Lovejoy Library out at SIUE before there was a library. He actually was in a stable, former stable, cataloging magazines that were going to become part of the collections. I have another person that wrote about how they solved the issue when his immigrant grandfather came to Granite City. And it just so happened that there were 4 guys with the same name, first and last, all from the same place, all related, that all worked at the steel mill. And you can imagine the difficulty on figuring out whose paycheck was whose, or any number of other things, mail, all kinds of things. But they found a solution to that, and he's writing about that. There's just been a wide variety. I'm writing about my great-grandparents lived in Collinsville. And in 1931, during the Depression, the Nicol family, N-I-C-O-L, had a ball game against the Nichols family, N-I-C-H-O-L-S. It was for charity, and there was a lot of trash talk. I heard rumors that they were saying that the S stood for Satan. I don't know. But in any case, they played their game for charity during the Great Depression. And unfortunately, my family lost. So if you read the newsletter, I just gave you the punchline. But anyway, if you can write me a story about a memory that you have or a story that your grandparents passed down, just a couple of paragraphs, doesn't have to be much. We'd like to include as many as possible in the November newsletter. I think there's going to be a wide variety of stories, and we can't have too many because we just make the newsletter longer if we have more than we would usually print. So thank you again for inviting me to come and talk. My brand new neighbor that hasn't even moved in yet, as soon as she found out I was a Edwardsville historian, she goes, snap. So does anybody have any questions about LeClaire?
I should know this. What did they make at the factory?
They made plumbing fixtures primarily, but they also did casework for in homes, fireplace mantles, mirrors for above fireplace mantles. They would take orders for anything. There was a bar downtown that they did a 30-foot walnut bar. They did teller cages. The one place where you can go and really see a lot of their work is at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. The Nelson family were members of St. Andrew's when it was built in 1917. And the pews were all made in the factories. The altar was made in the factories. Some of those Italian craftsmen, it's beautifully carved. There are candlesticks on the altar that are made of brass and marble that were made in the factory. Oh, and the cornerstone was made because they also had a marble works. It was architectural marble that they sold all over the country. There are a number of Midwest capitals where the Capitol building has got marble stairs and that sort of thing that were made right here in Edwardsville. Yes.
More of a comment, talking about becoming a member. If you didn't get the newsletter, and it's always very interesting. Last month was the history of N.O. Nelson, and much more detail and a lot of stuff. And he didn't just do stuff here, he did stuff in other places, but this was his best work.
Exactly. He had the whole package here, whereas in other places he didn't have the village. He had another kindergarten at his factory in Bessemer, Alabama. That one was for the workforce in Alabama was about 50% white and 50% black, and he had a kindergarten for the black workers because you know, this wasn't that long after the Civil War, and it had a lot of adult education as well as being a kindergarten for the young children.
You said he had factories in France. Was it the same type? Marble, casework?
No, he didn't have factories in France. The name Leclerc came from Edmond Jean Leclerc, who was the father of profit sharing in Paris, France. And his company was written about in France and England, those two countries in particular. But he had factories in Bessemer. He had a factory in Indiana at one time. Another project was trying to feed the poor in New Orleans at cost. He had like 80 grocery stores in New Orleans. And in addition to that, he tried to make it basically farm to table. They had they had the farms, they had the dairies, they had the bakeries, and were trying to feed people at as little cost as possible. And then he had a home for consumptives in California, which that was for TB. He also did a TB camp just south of Edwardsville. Any other questions? Yes.
What was the population of Edwardsville when he first came here?
Excuse me. I think it was about 5,000 roughly. And so by the time they became part of Edwardsville in 1934, it came close to doubling the size of the town.
And then where did he come from?
He was born in Norway, came to the United States at the age of 2. They came through the port of New Orleans, where his mother got typhoid, his mother and one of his siblings, and died. And his father continued up the river with Nels and his sister. And they settled in the St. Joseph, Missouri area where there were a lot of other Norwegians. So that's where he grew up. And then he went into business in St. Louis. He learned bookkeeping during the war. He was in the Civil War, Union Army. And it's interesting to note that when World War I came along, he tried to volunteer. And they said they didn't need any 73-year-old soldiers. But he was willing, and to that end, he told all of his employees that if they were to volunteer for the war effort, that if the Army was paying them less than what he was paying them, he would make up the difference. Yes.
What's the northern and southern boundary? What made up the village of Clare?
Okay, on the west side is easy, the railroad tracks. The east side is Madison Avenue. The south end is, it's different on the two sides of Troy Road. It's McKinley on the west side, and it's Hadley on the east side of Troy Road. And then the factories on this end. Any other questions?
What does the NO stand for?
As far as we know, Nelson Oliver, although he has on occasion written Nelson Olaf, which is probably what he was born with. But that's a kind of the Scandinavian names were often a little different by our standards. Nelson. They called him Nels, N-E-L-S.
Thank you, Cindy. That was
You're
very
welcome.
informative. I like hearing that.